All right, everyone, turn to Job chapter 30. All right, so in the last lesson, we read the middle portion, pretty much, of Job's final, longest response to his friends. It's the final reply to Bildad's third discourse, which is the last discourse of his friends in general, and it was a very short one. The first part of it, his response, he spoke of God's wisdom, how it was incomparable to anything that man knows, how God, through wisdom, established the entirety of creation, and how despite everything that we know about it, it's nothing compared to what he knows. He then continued by talking about earthly wisdom on earth, what we can do with it, how a miner can dig deep into the hostile earth that no animals survive in. We can learn a lot about it, we can manipulate it and use it, but at the end of the day, it's still nothing compared to what God knows. And his reason for that was to illustrate that his friends, in asserting that God did things for certain reasons, completely missed the point that they're humans, he's better than them, and they can't understand him. Now, Job interspersed these while also talking about how God judges people, and then bemoaning his current condition. Both of them are generally, the first statement especially, how God judges people, is quite accurate. It is based on other scriptural evidence that we see. It's pretty true. Generally, God judges people in the future. He doesn't always do it here on earth immediately when they commit sins. He waits for their sins to bring forth the fruit that they've sown, and then it comes back on them and those who are affected by it. In chapter 29, which was the last one we went over last lesson, Job was bemoaning what he had lost. Part of it was the communion and wisdom he used to have from God. He no longer feels that closeness, and he doesn't feel the prophetic knowledge that he used to get from God. Part of it was he misses his children, all of whom are dead. And he misses the wealth and the ease that his life used to have, although that seems to take a back step. But by and large, the majority of chapter 29 is him missing the respect and status that he used to have in the city of Uz. He was a very well respected and influential man who was able to judge the wicked, establish easier times for the poor, give of his own to help those who couldn't help themselves, specifically the fatherless, the widows, and the infirm. And because of that, he believed that everyone in the city loved and liked and took care of him, and they'd be happy for him. That has not, of course, been what happened. Everyone turned their backs on him, and he misses what he thinks was how it used to be, where everyone did like him. I think that that's naivety on Job's part. He thinks that they felt that way because that's how he wanted them to feel. But as we all know from our own experiences on earth, when you do what's right, surrounded by people who don't, they don't appreciate it. They're not happy that you did that, and they're not going to lift you up. They're going to try to tear you down because your actions make them feel convicted about their actions. And they don't appreciate that in general. So we're picking up in chapter 30 now. Hopefully we'll be able to finish the end of his discourse tonight. In chapter 30, verse 1, he says, "But now they that are younger than I have me in derision, whose fathers I would have disdained to have set with the dogs of my flock. Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished? For want and famine they were solitary, fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste." So he immediately starts, this is a direct continuation of what he said before. He says, "But now they that are younger than I have me in derision." If you go back a bit, he says in verse, 21, "Unto me men gave ear, and waited and kept silence at my counsel. After my words they spake not again. My speech dropped upon them." You go down this whole thing, he talks about how influential he used to be. And then, but now, these that are younger, they have me in derision. They mock me. I'm below them now, even though I wouldn't have even set their fathers with the dogs of my flocks. Job is very harshly insulting the people around him who are mistreating him. He states that they are unfit to even serve with his animals. Well, more accurately, their lineage is unfit to even serve with their animals, that they're young, inexperienced, and know nothing. And yet, they're allowed to mock him, a man who once judged the masses and established justice for an entire city and was like a king in the army. He says, "Yea, whereto might the strength of their hands profit me, in whom old age was perished." In whom old age was perished is a strange phrase, but when you sort of look at what it was translated from, it essentially means the vitality was lost. He's saying, how could these people who are now mocking me, if I were powerful, how would they have helped me if they worked for me? He's saying they don't have any strength. Even if they served me, they used their hands in my service, it wouldn't have profited me. It wouldn't have been helpful. They had no strength. And then the reason for that is in verse 3. For want and famine, they were solitary. That word solitary there is translated from a word that means desolate or empty or barren. Fleeing into the wilderness in former time, desolate and waste, which is connected immediately to that. So he's saying these people, they were worthless. They had nothing. They had no food. They had nothing that they wanted, so they were weak and helpless. In verse 14, he says, who cut up mallows by the bushes and juniper roots for their meat. Meat, of course, just means food. Juniper is a hardy taproot that grows almost everywhere across the world, and it generally had like medicinal properties according to a lot of old cultures. No one's really sure if those were real properties or if they were just assumed, but it was an edible plant, that alongside mallow, which is a common one even now. He's stating that these people have to survive on roots and herbs of the field for their food. That's sort of an insult. If you had any sort of wealth to yourself and you had any sort of strength, you would have meat because you'd be hunting animals. These people can't even hunt wild animals. They have to survive on the plants alone. In verse 5, he says, they were driven forth from among men. They cried after them as a thief, to dwell in the cliffs of the valleys, in caves of the earth, and in the rocks. So before I get to this part, it's important to note that despite the evolutionary nonsense that revolves around it, there were groups of men that we have archaeological evidence of that lived in caves and rocks and cliffs. The people that they call cavemen, a lot of them say Neanderthals, even though that's a specific group from one specific valley, not a name given to an entire type of person. Those people did exist. They were not cavemen like they're talked about, where they were half man or half ape or some sort of weird transitionary form. The skeletal evidence we've found, if you were to compare it to modern human skeletal evidence, is identical. You take one, give him a clean shave, let him stand upright, and put him in our clothing, he'd look indistinguishable from any of us. But they did live in the caves and the rocks. Obviously, that's not a very dignified existence when you have Job living in a great mansion in a city surrounded by other people doing the same. Henry Morris believes these men, after the scattering of languages at the Tower of Babel, did not try and form real societies. They fled and they hid in the rocks because they refused to accept any of the light of God, because they were still in rebellion from that event, and that they swiftly died out afterwards while living like savages. We don't really know for certain, but given the way Job is talking about these people who seem to be directly interfering with him, they were not very high class or high society people. And in verse 7, he says, among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they were gathered together. Braying is the sound that a donkey makes, but it really just refers to the noise of wild animals. These people, they were grunting and growling like savage animals, just out in nature under the bushes and the trees. They were children of fools, yea, children of base men. They were viler than the earth. So they were lower than dirt, is essentially what he's saying. Someone says, I came from dirt. These guys came from less than dirt. To say that they were children of fools, according to the Bible, the fool hath said in his heart there is no God. That's another reason that some people believe these are some of the people who fled from the Tower of Babel. The whole point of the Tower of Babel was shaking your fist at God and not doing what he wanted. It was the first pagan religion, believing there was a God other than actual God. And that, of course, is very foolish behavior. He's saying these people are descended from those people, the people who started that. All in all, it is a very aggressive takedown of the people who were mocking, belittling, and abusing him. And yet, in verse 9, he says, and now am I their song, yea, I am their byword. A byword is a warning. It's essentially what if you walked by and there's a place that's been destroyed and you warn someone, you say, don't do this or you'll end up like them, like Sodom and Gomorrah, that's a byword. These people are using him as a picture to their own people, saying, don't do these certain things or you'll end up like that guy. Now he's that, to the lowest of the low. In verse 10, he says, they abhor me, they flee far from me, and spare not to spit in my face. So they're abusing him directly, and they want nothing to do with him at the same time. No one is coming to him for help anymore, not even the worst. And in verse 11, he says, because he hath loosed my cord and afflicted me, they have also let loose the bridle before me. So to loose his cord, cord seems to be talking about a bowstring. I think that's accurate because if you go back to verse 20 of the prior chapter, he says, my glory was fresh in me and my bow was renewed in my hand. This is in the context of him being a mighty man in that country. Especially in those days, if you had range on your enemy in a combat situation, well, I guess that's really all combat in general, but a bow is about the best range you were going to get, then you would win. That's basically what it boiled down to. You could kill them before they could even reach you. So someone who was a good archer, there were few people who would be scarier than that. Well, God, I believe that the he's talked about in verse 11 is God, hath loosed my cord. He took away his strength, his ability to defend himself, and afflicted me. They have also let loose the bridle before me. So because he's now weak and helpless, these people are allowed to abuse him. In verse 12, upon my right hand rise the youth. They push away my feet, and they raise up against me the ways of their destruction. They mar my path. They set forward my calamity. They have no helper. They came upon me as a wide breaking in of waters. In the desolation they rolled themselves upon me. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my soul as the wind, and my welfare passeth away as a cloud. So the picture is pretty clear. The young men of this city and of the surrounding bandits and lowlifes are physically harassing, beating Job, taking anything that he happens to get in the garbage that he's living in. His welfare, he talks about in verse 15, refers to physical wealth or belongings and possessions. And when he compares them to the wind, I believe that's because the wind is what destroyed his family. It's what killed his children. The east wind smote the corners of the house they were in and killed them all. He is equating these people directly with the judgment that he suffered for a crime he's still trying to figure out why that happened. In verse 16, he says, and now my soul is poured out upon me. The days of affliction have taken hold upon me. To have your soul poured out upon you, it could also be read to have your soul poured out of you. His soul, what he's saying is his soul is leaving him. He feels like he's not even a human anymore, like everything that makes him alive has already left or is leaving him. He says, my bones are pierced in me in the night season, and my sinews take no rest. Once again, we see him talk about not being able to sleep. His terrible, terrible affliction, this awful disease that he has, prevents him from getting any gainful rest, which I believe is part of the reason he speaks so foolishly and out of turn, though that does come from somewhere within his heart as well. In verse 18, by the great force of my disease is my garment changed. It bindeth me about as the collar of my coat. His disease, the primary thing that we were told about it by God himself when describing it, was that he's covered in boils from head to toe. Boils that he scratches with a piece of broken pottery because they itch and are in pain all the time. What this means is, I believe, they were weeping sores, and that has disgustingly marred all of his clothing and essentially caused it all to cleave to his skin. He talked before about how his clothes were basically a second layer of skin on him at this point, a truly terrible fate, and that's how he was living, misery and pain all the time. He says, he hath cast me into the mire, and I am become like dust and ashes. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. So this is clearly him directly calling to God again. He hath cast me into the mire, and become like dust and ashes. He's surrounded by dust and ashes because he is in a garbage pit. We saw that at the end of chapter 2 of Job, that he was in the dust and the ashes. And then when his friends came to see him, he was still in it. In verse 20, he says, I cry unto thee, thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Now, this is interesting. He's saying he prays to God, and he doesn't get an answer. Now, God does not hide his face from his own people. We never see that happening in the Bible, except for one specific instance, and that is in Psalm 66:18, that if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So the only way that God would not be answering Job if he were praying is if Job had a sin that he was not acknowledging and repenting of. According to Psalm 34:15, God will not be abandoning his people. He will not be ignoring their prayers. His ears are open unto the righteous. He hears them, which means either Job was harboring a sin and was not repenting of it, or he did not realize he had committed a sin because he was in his pride, or God was answering and he wasn't listening. I believe it's probably that one. He wants an answer to this. He wants to know why this is happening, and then he wants it to end. He's not satisfied with the answer of, you have to endure, and I'm going to carry you through this. He doesn't want that answer, so he's not listening to that answer. I believe that's why he's not getting an answer, because this complaint, God does not just abandon his people. He doesn't leave them out in the cold with no help on earth. His strength is sufficient for the troubles of the day, every time. In verse 21, he says, thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. Thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, and dissolvest my substance. God, of course, is not cruel. He believes that he is because he's suffering in all of this agony. But God is not the one inflicting it on him. God is the one allowing the devil to inflict it on him. It's the devil who's the cruel one. God is the one who's not cruel because he is preventing Job from dying, because he intends to give him greater blessings in the future. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, Job is at this moment the safest human being on earth. Nothing can kill him because God told the devil you're not allowed to kill him. He's the only person who cannot die on earth at this time because God's hand of protection is over him. He can suffer, but he can't die. God is not cruel. God is not his enemy. He's not afflicting him or turned against him. God is his only ally in the entire world at this time. He says, thou liftest me up to the wind. Thou causest me to ride upon it, dissolvest my substance. This could be metaphorical, that God is using storms to tear down what he has. It could be quite literal, that Job is so emaciated and thin because he's had so little to eat, and when he does eat, it doesn't do much for him, that the wind itself is actually lifting him and moving him around. That is a possibility as well, but I can't say for certain. In verse 23, he says, "For I know that thou wilt bring me to death, and to the house appointed for all living." So the reason he believes God is cruel is because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that eventually he's going to die. He's a human. He's not going to live forever. He's going to die, and he's going to go to the house of all living, or house appointed for all living, which is the heart of the earth. At the time, it was paradise and hell, which were separated by a chasm, but they were in the same location, and they were both holding cells. That's the house appointed for all living. He knows he's going to die and go there. He wants to go there now so the suffering will be over, and he believes that God is cruel for not sending him there now. Of course, principle of God is every moment that you have on this earth to do his good will, or if you're not saved, to repent, is a blessing. Every single moment. If you think that you're living just to suffer, that's because you're wrapped up in your own pride, like Job is here. And that is why Job feels this way, because it's all about him. He took his eyes off of God. If he were looking to God, then he would know that he's here for a purpose. This is happening for a reason, because God is not cruel. God's never been cruel to him throughout his entire life. And there's no reason to assume that he would be now. So he should know better. But he's focused on himself. He's taken his eyes off of God. And now all he wants to do is die. The fact that God won't kill him, he proclaims, makes God cruel. This is as foolish as someone who tries to hold out a pen and says, if God's real, let him catch this pen, and then drops it. You don't get to order God around. You don't get to set the standard and say, God is this if he doesn't or does do this. Not how it works. All I can think whenever I read this part is in Romans. Nay, O man, but who art thou that answerest against God? Shall the thing formed say to he that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? We don't get the authority to ask God questions about why he does what he does. We don't. He's the sovereign. He will do whatever he pleases. It's our job to take it, listen to him, and honor him through it, always. In verse 24, he says, howbeit he will not stretch out his hand to the grave, though they cry in his destruction. Job is now saying something very dangerous and very blasphemous, which we'll see in verse 25. Did not I weep for him that was in trouble? Was not my soul grieved for the poor? So he's saying God won't reach his hand out to me. I'm in the graves. I'm already destroyed. I'm rubble. I'm completely wiped out. So even though I'm crying for mercy in all of this, or crying for an end just to be destroyed, he won't do it. But didn't I do that when I was a human? Didn't I weep for the poor and those that were in trouble? My soul was grieved for them. What he's asking is, why isn't God's? If I felt this way for those who were in distress, then why doesn't God feel this way for me? This is blasphemy of blasphemy. Job is now putting himself on the same level as God and asking why God's not doing something that he did. This is extremely foolish, something terrible to say. And we know that because God demands Job's repentance at the end of the book, which Job gives him immediately when God is done speaking. There is no question here that Job is saying something we're misunderstanding. This here is a terrible thing to say. It's completely incorrect. And it is on the same level as a pagan priest attempting to claim God's mantle and try to forgive sins like a Catholic does, claiming the title of God and saying that you can do what God can do. It's not true. Job is not like God. He is certainly not better than him. And him assuming this or asking this question, even though he may pretend that it's in rhetoric, it's a rhetorical question. I already know the answer. Well, then you shouldn't have said it, because it's a very foolish and dangerous thing to say. He says in verse 26, when I looked for good, then evil came unto me. And when I waited for light, there came darkness. My bowels boiled and rested not. The days of affliction prevented me. I went mourning without the sun. I stood up and I cried in the congregation. I am a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. My skin is black upon me and my bones are burned with heat. My harp also is turned to mourning, my organ into the voice of them that weep. He's saying he went trying to do good in the world and he was punished for it. In verse 28, he says he stood up and cried in the congregation. That sounds like when things were taken from him, when these young men descended upon him and took everything that he had, which is the reason he's out of the city. He tried to get it back. He went to the people and asked for help, and none of them helped him. That's part of what he was crying about in the prior chapter. The same thing he was bemoaning was the lost respect and honor of the people around him. No one helped him when he needed help, not one person, even though he always gave of his own to help other people. He says, I'm a brother to dragons and a companion to owls. Owls, some people try to rephrase that as ostriches. I could not find a reason for that. The same word the Jews use for owls, or the Hebrews use for owls, is the same one translated owls here, although it is a slightly different word. It means the same thing. Dragons refers to great sea creatures, whales, and bizarrely, jackals specifically. Jackals are small coyote-like animals that live in the Middle East. They're scavengers and opportunity hunters. They'll kill something that can't defend itself, but mostly they just eat whatever they can find that won't fight back. Job is essentially saying he's as bad as a wild animal. That's what he's living in. He's a brother to these creatures because he lives out in the wilds with no roof over his head, no real clothing on, and has to scavenge whatever he can to survive. He has to survive off of what other people leave for him. My skin is black upon me, and my bones are burned with heat. This is part of what he's talking about in verse 29. He's companion to these partially because he's outside all the time, and it's burning his skin because the sun is very aggressive. I know that from terrible personal experience because I burn very easily. Evidently, Job was not having a good time in the sun either, as he'd been there for weeks or months by this point. He says, my harp also is turned to mourning, and my organ unto the voice of them that weep. So we know that the harp and the organ, they're not really what we would call a harp and an organ, but they are words for instruments. So what he's talking about here is one of two things. Either just the noise in general that used to be joyful and uplifting is now very dark and depressing and sad because he has nothing left, or it's that he literally used to make poetry and music, that was a thing that he used to do, sometimes probably honoring God, and that now all that it's about is mourning and weeping because he has nothing else to praise God for. That, of course, as we've covered, is untrue, but that seems to be what he's talking about. And now he starts in on the final part of his response. I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? So he's saying he made a decision, an arrangement essentially with his eyes that he's not going to look on a woman. So if he's not going to look on a woman that's not his wife, then why would he think about one? It's a rhetorical question. He says in verse 2, for what portion of God is there from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Strange means not strange as in bizarre or unusual per se, more like severe and extremely painful. His point is God punishes people who do wicked things. So that's why he made this covenant with his eyes, to not betray his wife. He'll talk about more why he would equate the two, because there's a lot of people nowadays who will say adultery is bad, but also we shouldn't really punish it. Job's going to lay out why that isn't the case in this chapter as well. He says in verse 4, doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? If I have walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. So he's saying God sees everything he does. And what he's now going to do is issue a series of, I believe, 16 challenges, where he's going to say, if I do this, let this happen. That's what's going to happen. He's going to go through this many times over the course of this chapter. So we'll start in verse 5. If I have walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit. Vanity generally means emptiness, but we can tell through parallelism that in this verse, it's talking about deceit. The second half of the verse completes the first, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit. That's what he's talking about. Living dishonorably and dishonestly, so that he can get ahead in life. If that has happened, let me be weighed in an even balance that God may know mine integrity. Only reason he'd say that is because he's asserting that he has not lived that way. That the lies that his friends have slandered him with, that he has been deceiving everyone essentially for decades, aren't true. He did not live the way that they claimed. He did not live dishonestly. He lived a very honorable life. Now, up to this point, I have no reason to think that Job is a liar. He said some very foolish things, but he hasn't said anything that I look at and believe is just incorrect. God never accuses him of lying. What God does say is that he is proud and foolish for the things that he has said, which is very true. But I believe everything Job talks about in this chapter is true. He's obviously not perfect, but the things listed here, I don't believe that he's done. In verse 7, if my step hath turned out of the way, and mine heart walked after mine eyes, and if any blot hath cleaved to mine hands, then let me sow and let another eat. Yea, let my offspring be rooted out. That already happened to him. He had great flocks and fields. All of them were taken, and his family was wiped out. His point is, that's just and honorable. I would accept that if I had done what he states in verse 7. My step hath turned out of the way, mine heart walked after mine eyes, any blot cleaved to mine hands. These seem to be just general ways of talking about sin, but I think the middle portion of this gives away what he's talking about. Mine heart hath walked after mine eyes. This is still hearkening back to him talking about being an adulterer. But really, I think in general, it refers to just following after lusts. You decide that you want a lot of food, so you're going to go get some food. You decide you want this, you're going to do things to get it. Or this, you're going to do things to get it. Christians aren't supposed to live that way. We're not supposed to look at something we want and then try to get it. Or if we see something we want, we're to pray about it. And if God says no, then we don't get it. That's how God's people are supposed to live always. They're supposed to be content with what they have. It's a good testimony to him. Job knew that. And so he's stating if that's not how he lived, then everything he has should be taken from him. He says, if mine heart have been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind unto another, and let others bow down upon her. So what he's saying is, if I have committed adultery, let my wife go find a different man. Now, obviously, Job would not wish that upon himself. His point is, he has not committed adultery. And he says, he expounds on this one specifically. The others, you'll notice, he gave the if and then for and then moved on. He does not here. In verse 11, for this is an heinous crime. Yea, it is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. He believes he should be judged and killed by men if he were an adulterer. For it is a fire that consumeth to destruction and would root out all mine increase. He's not even saying, in this one, the judgment that God should levy on him is that his wife leaves him and goes to be with someone else. Him losing everything as a result of adultery, he's saying that should not just be like a judgment from God for me doing this terrible thing. That's just what will happen, because an adulterer will lose everything he has, because it's a consuming fire that destroys everything. This is the reason that adultery, frankly, should be punished, should not be tolerated in society. There's a reason for it, and it's because it is a consuming fire that destroys everything it touches. It wipes out entire families all over. Everyone who basically touches it is destroyed by and large. Now, it is possible for God to forgive everything. We see that when he forgives the adulterous woman. She repented, and she had clearly sinned because he told her, go forth and sin no more. God can forgive it. But the sin is one of the worst. Job lays that out very clearly. And so anyone who tries to say in society that it's not that big a deal, or it's a thing that people are, let them do whatever they want, that is not only far from biblical, it's far from logical. That's not how society responds to a sin of this magnitude. In verse 13, he says, if I did despise the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God riseth up, and when he visiteth? What shall I answer him? Did not he that made me in his womb make him? Did not one fashion us in the womb? So he's saying, when one of my servants, which is really a slave, he was a wealthy man, he had what we would consider slaves, and possibly what most people would consider slaves, working for him. At the very least, probably indentured servants who had no choice but to work for him. When they came to him with a problem, even when it was something he did wrong, which he states when in the end of verse 13, when they contended with me, he did something that they decided was wrong, and they came to him and said, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this, even though he owned them. He did not take it out harshly on them. He did not try to tear them down for that, or act like they had no say in anything, because he recognized that they were people. And even though their livelihood was in his hand, that didn't mean he was free to harm them. They deserved just the same treatment from him that he received from God, because they were both people, and just like they could be delivered into his hand, he states in verse 14, he can easily be delivered into God's, because both are people, both were formed in the womb by the same God. This is verse 15. There is another mark against abortion. It is not just a chemical process that happens to create a fetus that is not a human. God forms people in the womb, as it states. In verse 16, if I have withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof, for from my youth he was brought up with me, as with a father, and I have guided her from my mother's womb. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, and if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless, when I saw my help in the gate, then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade, and my arm be broken from the bone. So this is a pretty not really broad actual topic coverage. He states a lot of verses, but mostly repeats the same sort of thing over and over. If I've withheld the poor from their desire. Desire is not just what they want. He's talking about what they need. Someone needs food or clothing or anything else, and they don't get it. He says, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail. The widows that he takes care of, if they ever came to him and needed help and he told them no, that'd be causing their eyes to fail. They went to him for help and they were turned aside. Or have eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof. It sounds like every time he had food, he gave portions of it to other people. He did not just prepare food for himself or have food prepared for himself. He had food prepared for other people who had none, regularly, at meal times. That was part of his daily meal routine. For from my youth he was brought up with me, as with a father, and I have guided her from my mother's womb. What he's saying here is when I was a child, from the moment of my birth and on, since I have been aware of my surroundings, I have been working to help these people with everything that I could and everything that I have. He's been living this way since he was a child. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, It's pretty simple. People don't have clothing or shelter, and they're in dangerous conditions. If his loins have not blessed me, if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, a continuation of verse 19, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless when I saw my help in the gate. And this is a very direct one. If he took advantage of these people, which he never did, and which God very harshly judges. That was one of the main reasons Israel was torn apart, was how they treated the people who could not help themselves, generally by enslaving them, basically, economically speaking. Then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade, and my arm be broken from the bone. I don't think there's any symbolic language or reasoning there. Losing your arm would be a terrible thing, losing both especially. You can't do much of anything in the world without an arm or two, and that's what he's stating. He should not be able to do anything in the entire world if he lived this way, but he didn't. In verse 23, for destruction from God was a terror to me, and by reason of his brightness I could not endure. That's the reason that he helped these people from his youth. He knew that God judged those who didn't. That if you had the means to help those who needed help and you didn't help them, God would take it from you one way or another, and then he'd punish you much harsher. He knew that. And it was that fear that kept him giving things to the other people. We know this also from earlier chapters where he talked about being in fear of this happening. Him losing everything was his greatest fear. He lived in fear of it daily. In the night, he was worried about it all the time and prayed it would never come upon him. And then it did. He's been fearing this for a very long time, and he always did, and so he lived this way because of it. In verse 24, if I have made gold my hope, or have said to the fine gold, thou art my confidence, if I rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because mine hand had gotten much, if I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above. So, this is reminiscent of Luke. I cannot remember the exact chapter. I just read over it today in my normal reading of the foolish rich man who had great abundance and his barns were full, and he said to his soul, soul, we have everything laid up for us. We can live sumptuously for the rest of our days. And then God killed him that night. He's essentially saying that he did not live that way. He was wealthy, but his confidence wasn't in that. And that's pretty clear from what he said before. He was afraid. He was terrified. He was extremely wealthy, more wealthy and powerful than anyone around him. And he was still afraid of losing everything in a heartbeat. If I rejoiced because my wealth was great, my hand had gotten much. If I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness. So that's an interesting one. Why would looking at the sun be a problem? Or the moon? Well, first I'd like to point out something interesting about that verse. The sun is, of course, it shines, it's bright. The moon, he doesn't say is bright. He says it walks in brightness. Job understood that the moon itself did not illuminate anything. It just reflects the sun's light. He recognized that. It's another piece of the vast array of natural knowledge about the world that ancient man had that was lost for millennia. And it was done so because of pagan idolatry, which is actually what he's talking about here. When he says that he was not beholding the sun or the moon, he means he wasn't worshiping them, like the people around him, like all the pagans. Because the sun and the moon are generally the core of almost every pantheon of pagan deities everywhere that you go in the world. If my heart hath been secretly enticed by what? Well, if you look in the latter half of that, or my mouth hath kissed my hand, that's an old pagan ritual, or part of an old pagan ritual. The kissing your own hand. It's partially related to Nimrod's worship. Nimrod's whole thing was worshiping mankind, specifically him, because that put him in charge. But the worship of man in general, such as the divine man, like Pharaoh saying they're descended from kings, or shoguns saying that they're part divine spirit and that's why they're in charge, that is idolatry itself. You're proclaiming yourself somehow a god and also a man, essentially counterfeiting the promise of God. That's really what it boils down to, because the devil can't create. He just takes and counterfeits whatever God says. And so that's where that came from. The kissing the hand is basically worshiping mankind. Job is stating, he's equating the confidence in gold with pagan idolatry, stating that if you trust in your money to save you, that's because you're a pagan. You're worshiping things of the world. You think that your wealth or anything else that you have is capable of controlling the world and keeping you safe, and it isn't. And he didn't live that way. He did not find confidence in any of these things. They were blessings. That's why he gave them to other people. He recognized that as God gave them to him, he could take them away easily. So there's no reason to try and hoard or cling to them or use them as a safety blanket. He was always going to die, and he was always going to be judged for his actions. So he might as well do with what God gave him what he's supposed to do. In verse 29, he says, if I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself where evil found him, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul. If the men of my tabernacle said not, oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors to the traveler. If I covered my transgressions transgressions as Adam, by hiding mine iniquity in my bosom? Did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out of the door? So this is it's a series of different topics that are all somewhat related. If I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him. So he had enemies, as everyone did. He did not rejoice when they were torn down. He didn't pray for their destruction. I know that there are people in the Old Testament who did. David, for example. Job didn't, and apparently he wasn't supposed to. He knew that God would not appreciate that sort of attitude, so he did not try to lift himself up that way. He says, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul. He did not wish these people to be harmed or in any way try to tear them down. He left it to God. If the men of my tabernacle, those are his men, the people under his household or within his ranks, said not, oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. He's saying even when the other people wanted to hurt them, we're speaking curses at them. Oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. That essentially they're saying, if only we had him. We're not satisfied with what we have. We need that guy, the enemy. We need to get him. We need to kill him. Then we'll be satisfied. It's pretty reminiscent of David's mighty men. Every time they saw someone who vaguely inconvenienced David or said a bad word about him and they wanted to go take his head off, it's the same attitude. Job had loyal men, and they wanted to kill people or otherwise harm people who were his enemies. He did not allow them to do that. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors to the traveler. I can't tell if this is a new topic since Job bounces around a lot in his current state. But it could also be very directly related, that when these people were then brought low by God, they were the people on the street, and he didn't turn them away. The stranger did not lodge in the street. Someone needed a roof over their head. He took them in. I opened my doors to the traveler. If I covered my transgressions as Adam, by hiding mine iniquity in my bosom. So he has an acute knowledge of Adam, what he did, and then how he tried to hide it. This is not unknown information until Moses wrote it down. Job knew about it. And he knew about it clearly, pretty intimately. So much so that was essentially a way you could curse someone, was by saying that you did what Adam did. In fairness, if you were the man who brought sin upon all humanity, you'd probably be looked upon disfavorably for quite a while because of it. And in verse 34, did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out of the door? This is back in line with helping people who were on the street. He'd see a lot of people who needed help, and he wouldn't turn them away because they were a burden to him. He'd bring them in. And you notice he says families as well. This is not groups. For those who try to say Christian charity is letting anyone come over the borders of your country whenever they want, bear in mind, he said families, not groups of 25 to 30-year-old men who are of military age and are here to have children. These are families. These are people in need, and they're entire units. There is a difference. He did not let invaders into his home, although he did not try to tear them apart either. And then in verse 35, he says, oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, that mine adversary had written a book. So he wants God to listen to him, and he's convinced that God's not listening to him. God is, of course, very intently listening to this entire conversation. We'll see later that there's a storm going on around them while they're having this debate. Either it's been going the whole time or it formed over the course of their discussion. It's out of that storm, a great whirlwind in the sky, that God speaks. He is here directly in presence, not just because he is everywhere. He's paying special attention to this. He is here and he's hearing everything, and he's also writing it down in a book. He also here again calls God his adversary. God is not his adversary. We've covered that. But this is a piece of rhetoric that Job has repeated many times. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. Saying if all of this was in a book, if all my accusations were written in a book too, then I'd keep them with me. And why? I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince, I would go near unto him. If you're wondering why he's talked about the number of his steps, back in verse 4 of this very chapter, doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? That rhetorical question, he has now answered. He's saying, no, he hasn't. He hasn't been paying attention. If he were to lay his accusations against me, I'd declare to him my steps and prove why I shouldn't be punished for this. If my land cry against me, or that the furrows likewise thereof complain, if I have eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life, what he's saying is, if his land didn't bring forth prosperously, so he stole or used usury to get other people's stuff, let thistles grow instead of wheat and cockle instead of barley, the words of Job are ended. So a very abrupt end to this long tirade, some of which was rational, some of which was true, much of which was foolish. He said some very harsh things about his God, everyone's God, but his as well, that he should not have said, and which God is not happy that he did say. He compared himself to the Lord more in these last 2 chapters than he has the entire rest of the book. And he's laid blasphemies at the feet of the Lord, but most of them could be excused with just basic foolishness or simple pride. He didn't think through maybe how this could be interpreted. And so by saying that God isn't treating me very fairly, he doesn't realize that he's saying God is lying. I don't think that Job is that much of a fool to lose that part. He'd have to be willingly ignorant to not notice that. But here, it's pretty explicit. He is comparing himself to the Lord directly and essentially saying, I have not done wrong, so I should not be punished for this. That's what he's saying. Now, the point that he misses, even though he didn't do any of these things wrong, he's done a lot of other things that are wrong, obviously, because he's a human. He didn't cover every sin. He just covered a few sins. The amount that you can fit into 40 verses. That's not all the sins. He's committed some sins that he absolutely deserves to be punished for. That much is true. But the problem is he still doesn't understand that he's not being punished for his sins. You see, we have now gone 31 chapters into this book. About 28 of them have been actual debate between Job and his friends, all trying to figure out why this has happened to him. That is the core message, the core reason for their entire argument. Elihu and his friends were all basing their knowledge on Satan's words, basically, that they didn't realize was Satan's words. A spirit came to Elihu in his sleep and told him that God punishes mankind for wicked deeds. So they believed Job did wicked deeds and he's being punished. Job said, I didn't do wicked deeds, but I'm being punished for them anyway. That's Job's conclusion that he's come to throughout all of this. It's no better than his friends. As opposed to, well, honestly, though, his friends are a little less blasphemous. Job has told them that they have put words in God's mouth. They've said foolish things about him, and they have. God makes that clear in his response, too. But they've not done what Job has done, where they said God is treating you unfairly. They said God's treating you fairly, we're slandering you. That's basically what it boils down to. They slandered Job, but not God. Job is slandering God routinely throughout his responses. He's done it several times now. That's a much graver transgression. And even though the book is not done yet, this massive segment of it, the majority of it is. What we're going to see next is Elihu's response to Job. Job does not respond to Elihu at all. He's a younger man who seems somewhat wise, likely saved, who was in the area listening to all of this, and he then intervenes. His intervention solves nothing, resolves nothing, and answers nothing. He may as well not even speak. But he does speak, and then God answers at the end of that. But this majority portion of it we have now just finished. And I would like to give what is essentially the one takeaway that we should all get from this. We've gleaned a lot of information about mankind itself, about the nature of human debate, about God, how he created the world, some of its natural forces, and we've gained insight into how early man saw the world and how much more they understood than we think. But all of that's mostly academic. A lot of it doesn't really help us in our daily lives. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, first, don't think you have all the answers. And then certainly don't try to tell people that you have all the answers, because you're just going to cause fights. Second, do not engage in earthly debate. It's a waste of your time. Certainly not when theological matters are involved, but really any matters. Don't engage in debate. You're not going to convince a single person ever. You're not God. Your words don't have the power to sway the hearts of men. If someone believes something, you will not change their minds at all. So don't engage in debate. It's a complete waste of your time as a Christian. You have better things to do. And third, do not speak out of emotion. Job has said before, he's very emotional and distraught by all this, and he's aware of that, and it's influencing his words, but he doesn't care. He's going to say it anyway. He stated that in prior chapters. That is the height of foolishness. Do not think that just because you're in a bad state, God is not going to hold your words against you. He will. Your words matter. Just because if you're conscious enough to realize that you're speaking out of turn, then you're conscious enough to not do it. Do not speak out of emotion or rage or discomfort or anything else, certainly as it pertains to God, because you will say foolish things and you will bring the judgment of God upon you and be forced to repent like Job does, or face judgment.